We're putting you live now.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. So, I won't do a big introduction again to save time, but we're now going to hear, I think, a really interesting and informative talk from John Atkinson around how to change the whole system. So, John, again, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Helen, and delighted to be on. So what I've got is a bit of input, really, on thinking about how systems work and therefore how we might change them. And people get very hung up on the systems word. A system for me could be you, it could be your team, wherever they are, whether it's on a ward, in an admin environment, it could be your hospital, your trust, it could be the whole health system. And you know, this was the basis of my thinking when we designed Total Place, which was a program that looked to change a whole raft of things across the whole system in UK, both about health and about many other social settings. So let's launch straight into the sort of slides and have a look at that. So you'll lose sight of me while we do this. But the key thing in all of this for me goes back to that old phrase that is, you know, problems aren't solved from within the level of thinking that created them. So if we want to change the whole system, we need to think differently about how the system works. And most times, where we sit in a system changes what we think about its performance and about what it does. So this guy, Jackson, US Supreme Court judge in 1941, says the matter does not appear to me now as it appears to appear to me then. And he's referring to a question he was asked, which is saying, why is it when you're a Supreme Court judge, you're viewing a matter of law, a real technical, hard, discipline subject, differently to the way you viewed it when you were a federal prosecutor? And this guy's one of the best legal brains in the US. He went on to be a prosecutor at Nuremberg trials. And what he's basically saying is, well, where you are in the system alters how you think about it. So when I start to work with places, talk to people about how their systems work, usually either very explicitly, you know, in the old days on a piece of paper, now on a PDF that someone sends you, you get something that looks like this, and we're all seen them, and we're all familiar with them. And this is your standard sort of organization chart. And in it, there are all sorts of assumptions about how things work that we take for granted, but which aren't necessarily always helpful. It's not that they're bad things or they're good things, it's just that they are limited things. And so one of the assumptions in that is the people in the boxes are the system. And of course, when we start to deal with issues of health, patients, carers don't usually appear on these charts anywhere. Other organizations don't usually appear on these charts anywhere, and yet there's all sorts of dependencies in there about how it works. Another assumption is, for example, that there's a hierarchy of information, that the person at the top knows what's going on, and she or he passes that down the chain, and it gets cascaded out, and by the time it gets to the bottom, everybody knows perfectly what they've got to do. And we know that that doesn't work either. And the other thing it does is divide us into little groups and little teams who lose connection with each other. And that's even just within one organization. So usually when I put that up and we start to explore that with people, people say, yeah, that's not really how we get things done around here. We get things done in a different sort of way. But if we try and work our system as if it really did work like this, it works for us up to a point, and then we start to find things go wrong. So this was something we did in Total Place on learning and skills. And basically, this is what happens when you try and run a small English county on a hierarchical tree. And what you find is money comes in from all sorts of different sources, so those boxes near the top. And then there's a line of boxes about a third of the way from the bottom, nursery and primary school, secondary school, colleges, all the places where we want to spend money. And then there's all sorts of convoluted routes in the middle where we try to make things work. And if we take that to a healthcare example, this is a wonderful example of how a health system works if you try and run it as an organogram. This is Obamacare, and you will notice somewhere on that screen, if you take time and your eyes scan very quickly, you will find patients on it. You'll find clearly the most important person on it is the Secretary for Health and Human Services, but my guess is you find the IRS, the tax agency, quicker than you find patients as you start to scan around that. So it sort of seems self-evident to us when we think about how systems work that trying to run them as big organization charts really doesn't work. And this is a very mechanistic way of thinking about things. It's got its roots in England in the Industrial Revolution, where people sat on the end of machines and serviced them to get a job of work done. And what we've found, I think, is as in an industrialized nation, once we start to deal with health on an industrialized scale, we've industrialized it. And that's not necessarily an ideal way to deal with human activity. And if you say, well, that's just the Americans, well, try drawing the NHS at the moment, see what that looks like. And this is the sort of thing that you'll see each year. I think these ones come from The Guardian. This is still an organisation chart. The big grey blob in the middle is the top in the old chart, and then it goes to a series of other bits, none of which connect to each other. So if you look at that chart, and this is 2008 because it was the one I was using, but the point remains the same. If you look at that chart and say, does the money that we invest in tackling childhood obesity give us the sort of return that we ought to expect from it? There's no way that we can ever answer that question, because the green box towards the two green boxes at the top, local government and local communities, and Department of Work and Pensions, well, they've got something to do with that. Department of Health, bottom right, blue, they've got something to do with that. Ministry of Defence, probably a bit less. Scotland, Wales, yeah, they're doing some of it too. Culture, media and sport. All our departments, transport, how we build roads, cycle paths, all of these things have an impact on the health of our young people. And we have no sense of how these things interact together, because we've split them into constituent bits. We're viewing it as a process that if we cut it up into tiny bits, we'll understand how it works and we can make it work more efficiently. And actually what we do is you lose the most important connectivity between things, which is what really makes them work. So this isn't a new thing. This guy, James Phillips Kay, known for all sorts of reasons, we named our business after him, was a surgeon working in the slums of Manchester in the 1830s, and he said the social body cannot be constructed like a machine on abstract principles, which merely include physical motions and their numerical results in the production of wealth. And it doesn't take a big mental jump to look at that and say, well, that's not a way to run a health service either. So we've known this a long, long time. And when I put this sort of picture up, people and say, well, doesn't your organisation or your place or your team work a little bit more like this? It sort of intuitively makes sense. This is actually a map of the internet by ISP, but it's a scale-free network. It could be a brain map, it could be a transportation map, it could be all sorts of things. But let's just imagine for a second it's a map of the health and care system in an English city. And let's imagine for a second that the green stuff is the acute provision, largely centred around a big hospital somewhere to the north of the city, with a little bit of outreach somewhere in the south. And let's assume that, say, the yellow is primary care, GP surgery spread all over the place, some bigger clusters, some smaller clusters, that the red might be community health and so on, purple might be social care. And what we see is that it connects in all sorts of different ways, and there are all sorts of different relationships at play and identities at play that all come together to get something done. So if our mental frame that forms our thinking of how we manage a process is one of an organogram, and the thing that we're really dealing with looks something like this, and this always feels to people who we go through it with, feels more intuitively right, then there's going to be a mismatch. And if the theory that you have in your head, the theory about how the system works and how the system really works are different, every time you try to change it, you're going to get some things right and all sorts of other things are going to happen that you didn't quite expect. So what I'm going to suggest is a way of thinking about how this multicolored, messy, linked up, networked sort of thing, a way that you might work with that as different to some of our traditional management and sort of leadership processes. So the first thing to think about is, for me, this is a living thing, and the study of living things when I was a kid was biology. So I went to look at some biologists to see what they had to say about how you might work with living things. And these two guys, Maturana and Varela, are from Chile originally, and now based later in Paris. would say certain things, many things, but one of them is you can look at organisms, whether they're single cellular things to ecosystems, and say, look, there's a variety of things that living things have in common. And one of the important ones for me is they evolve to be in relationship with their environment. And this is a symbiotic relationship. So the nature of the NHS in England is defined by the nature of England. The nature of it in Scotland is defined by the nature of it in Scotland, and the nature of it in Wales, and so on. And it defines the nature of that place too. So if you try to change one without any change in the other, you're creating quite a disturbance. And when there is that sort of disturbance or perturbation, the organism tries to stop it. It tries to absorb it back in. So at its most simple level, if I think back to my O-level biology, and you've got the amoeba under the microscope, and you drop a little bit of stuff in it that upsets it, it sort of spreads its arms around it and absorbs it into its body and spits out the waste. So the effect of trying to change living things is, by and large, they don't like it. They want to stay as they are. And if you manage to hold them disturbed long enough, then they'll adapt to this new condition. So the question, and these are good questions raised by a guy called Myron Rogers, worked with Myron for about 10 years, that are worth asking, is how do systems work in general? What's my understanding of how a big, messy, complicated human system, like a city or like a hospital or like a place, really works? And then how does this system specifically work? Because if I understand that, I might be able to answer some of the later questions, such as how do we actually work this system? How do I, as a system myself, need to work in and with it? And how would we ever know if we were making any difference? What would tell us that things were working or not working? And almost invariably, it's not the sort of output measures that we do all the time, number of interventions or whatever. And what I sort of really want to suggest to you is that there are a set of characteristics, sort of 5 big characteristics about how living systems work, which if we understand them and start to play with them, give us a clue as to what we might do that might make the slightest difference. And it's a sort of big 5, if you like. So I'm going to go through these and pose some thoughts and some questions and some things that strike me, and see if they're helpful to you in terms of what it might make to make anything happen differently. So this is Lorenzo's strange attractor, if you're interested in these things. This is all about chaos and complexity. And chaos and complexity means that things are sort of a bit messy, but they're not anarchic. It's stable. Stuff keeps getting done. So complexity results in order, not disorder. Just because the NHS is hugely complex and England is hugely complex and Great Britain is hugely complex and wherever you are in the world is hugely complex doesn't mean we're all in complete disorder. Actually, it's remarkably stable and we do some really good stuff. But one of the effects of this is that cause and effect can be quite distant in time and space. So you start to change something. If you go to the UK at the moment, the care system is under huge stress financially, and it is changing all sorts of practice. That will have an impact on how people are discharged from hospital, and it is. That will have an impact on the throughput of what you do with people when they're in your ward, when they come into A&E, wherever they do. It will have an impact on who chooses to come in and why they choose to come in. And yet, the changes that may be most felt may be a long way from where the impact was first being made, and it may happen sometime later. A really good way to see this happening with your teams is to draw a timeline back over a much longer time than you expect, and to plot all the things that have done and all the changes that have happened and all the things that you felt about that. And you'll start to see how some changes in one part of the system start to impact in others much later. So what you get with that is unintended consequences. There are always unintended consequences. They're not always unpredictable. They're not always negative. In fact, often they're the source of where we start to change. And penicillin, unintended consequence of leaving a dirty petri dish on a windowsill overnight. Was penicillin a good thing? Well, saved millions of lives. And if it kills our immune system and we as a species die out in 100 and so years, will have been a terrible thing. Time changes our perception the negativity or positivity of these consequences. But each time we try to manage the consequence without taking into account the complexity, we just have to put a new body, a new board, a new action list, a new set of costs, and the thing grows like Topsy, and you end up with that chart that looked like that was Obamacare. And like I say, it's easy to poke at other people's systems, but I think if we drew the NHS one, it would be every bit the same. So that's one thing. This is a flock of starlings. It's a murmuration. How do the starlings fly around without bumping into each other? Well, they follow a very simple set of basic rules. And so we spend a lot of time designing strategies and action points and plans and whatever. And these are all good and important things in trying to help us determine what we want to do. But what determines what actually gets done around here are so often some really simple and very much more basic rules. And from these simple and basic rules emerge our patterns of behaviour. So I don't know if this is true or not, but if a basic rule was, don't worry about your budget because we'll never let a hospital fail and you'll get bailed out. If you're a chief exec, that's really bad news because you get hauled up in front of the Secretary of State, you get beaten up regularly about something that you're not really that much able to control because there's an underlying pattern of behaviour that's much bigger than any influence you've got. So if you really want to change the way a system works, start thinking about what are the underlying rules that give rise to these global patterns of behaviour. What would we need to do to change some of those? And then things will start to change really, really rapidly. But we won't necessarily know in what direction or what will have as much control over it as we might like. Cognition. How do we get to know anything? This is a person looking at a tree. You could look at it the other way around. But in a human system, the way a system works, the way it looks, is very different depending on where you are in it. That goes back to the Jackson quote at the start. So if you really want to understand what's happening in a system, you've got to have multiple and diverse perspectives. So you can't just have the clinicians, you can't just have the administrators, you can't just have the patients, you can't just have the carers. You have to have the whole system in order to understand what goes on. But more than that, it's really not that simple, because what we see almost invariably is what we already know. In other words, we don't tend to make objective views of the world and therefore rationally analyze what's going on. We already have a perspective of how things are. And so in taking a view on things, it's almost already formed before we see things. So keep asking ourselves, how do we know things? How do we know that's what we're doing? What people say they do and what they do are often very different. And sometimes, again, if you really want to change the system as a whole, surfacing that difference, the difference between what we say we're doing and what's actually happening, can be very, very powerful. Networks. So that, that picture of all the messy thing, the greens and the reds and the yellows and the purples, is a network map. And networks hold information, the knowledge and the know-how that's necessary to get stuff done. So if we don't attend to the networks as much as the formal chart, then what we lose is our capacity to really understand what's necessary to happen. And it's really interesting that in networks, like on social media, it's my Facebook. If I've got a friend on Facebook, they're a friend. If I see them, we'll go and have a drink, a coffee, whatever, and we'll tell the same stories that we've told each other for 20 years. On my LinkedIn, I've got hundreds of people on there. It's people I've sort of slightly bumped into. If I see them, I'll probably pick up something new. So it's the weak ties. It's the people we hardly know that probably provide the new information that starts to change things. And yet we keep retreating into the things that we know best, the people that we know closest. And there we're telling ourselves the same stories all over and over again. And the last thing about working with a living system is that they tend to self-organize. So we continually use the past to determine what it is that we want to do, how we should react to the future, what's our business, and we reinforce this identity in all sorts of traditions and rituals and language, in the culture of the way that we do things. And if we're not mindful of how this self-organizing process works, and we just decide we're going to impose some kind of change on it, then very subtly or very brutally, the system that we're in will act to preserve its identity and draw us back to the things that we've always done. So really important for me in this is, if we're going to do change across a system and make it work, we too often launch in at the level of structures. How are we going to reorganize processes? What's the pattern of things that we need to do this? Systems. How does our IT work? How does our HR work? Whereas actually these are questions of identity. Who are we? What is it we want to really create together? What is it that binds us to ourselves? Professions in the health service are probably stronger than the health service itself at times. What's the information that we share? How do we know what's going on here? What's available to who in order that we might make great decisions? And relationships. How do we connect to each other in such a way that we might determine our actual capacity to build an enduring capacity to change? And if we do this, what emerges, if we focus on this identity, this information, the nature of these relationships, what emerges is meaning. We start to do things that really matter. We start to do actions that really make a difference, and we start to build trust. And I think this is a wonderful quote from Kelechi, who's DPH down at Plymouth. Change happens at the speed of trust. You can't change a human system quicker than people can trust that it's actually going to be for the better. So that's me. That's a real quick rattle through a load of stuff. I'll try and put me back so you can see me, which would be nice, I guess. Screen sharing, turn that off. Are you back? Am I back on? Can you see me, Helen? I can't hear you. Helen, I can't hear you, but I can see you, I think. No, can't hear a thing.
Okay, it wouldn't let me.
Yep, got you.
Here I am. Okay,
yep.
So I've got. Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
yeah.
I've got your first question.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay, what is your top tip for frontline staff who want to make a start in making system change?
Oh, so many places you could start. The first one is, I would say, top tip, go outside what you already know. And that's a really easy thing to say, but what it means is have a conversation with somebody about how what you're doing really works, who isn't the person you'd normally talk about that. So we all sit around and make a cup of tea and sit around and talk about how good it is or how bad it is or what we've just done, all the rest of it. Talk to somebody different. And what do they tell you about the experience that they have of dealing with you? And that will give you a different perspective. And the more perspectives we have on that, the better the sense we get. So go and talk to someone new and see that as work.
Yeah. So the second question that I got, I think it's kind of like a similar theme in a sense. It's about making it real. So given that you're the kind of pioneer of Total Place, just give us a little story or a little case study of applying these principles in some of your work, with regard to Total Place or place-based change.
Okay, so for Total Place, I mean, one of the principles we had is that comes out of this is people own what they create. So normally when you run these sort of big programs, what you do is you say, right, I want people who are going to look at what the relationship should be. Let's pick one that may be topical between primary care and acute care. And here's a couple of models that I want you to explore. What we said instead was, what matters to you in your place? What's the thing that causes you most problem? We'll work on that. And so it changes the focus of, there is somebody at the top who understands what the problem is and what you need to do to try and resolve it, to a focus that says, you know what's difficult for you, and we're going to help you try and work that out. And so it's a really subtle but fundamentally important shift in thinking. The other thing we did was make the networks work. So we got all the finance directors from all over the country to meet up. We got all the people working on early intervention with children's health to meet up. We got all the people in the Northwest to meet up. Some of them didn't like each other, didn't get on, it didn't work. Some of them it really clicked and connected. But if you don't create the opportunities for people to get into different conversations, then you don't release the intelligence that's in the system. So there's a couple of things, and there's the sort of legion, the number that we could go into, really.
Okay. So final question I have, how much influence can we have on the whole system as one person?
Well, in some respects, this is the butterfly flapping its wings question, isn't it? So if a butterfly flaps its wings, is there a storm in China or whatever the thing is, which was Lorenzo? And the answer is, we don't know. It's the nature of working in complexity is you can't say that there is a direct causal link between something I do as an individual, just there and then with a patient differently, and a global change in the system. And we know absolutely that it's only those things that will change it. Because nothing happens, if patients don't experience anything different, then nothing actually has really changed. So my sense of the question is, do it. And you may never know, you may never get the credit, but actually that's probably not why you're doing it anyway. And if in doubt, give it a go.
Very good. That's very wise. And final question, which is from me. So knowing what you know about the health and care system in England, like if you had a magic wand and you could do one thing that would make the system better in general, what would you do?
I would give it more time. I think it's really time intensive. We send out a 5-year view guidance that says you've got to work out what your place is going to be for your STP, for your Sustainable Transformation Plan, and then 2 weeks later we're telling people what places are, and they're going to be anyway, and 2 weeks later it's got to all be done. And actually, to make places and systems work, they have to have, it's a question of start slow to go fast. If you don't do the joining up and the connecting and the meaning making at the beginning, then it just unravels and you just end up doing it again and again and again, over and over and over.
Yeah.
So make time to actually do the important things rather than be busy and see to deliver and feel a need to be seen to deliver.
Yeah.
Of course you've got to deliver. And you can't do it if you're forever going round and round the same loops.
Yeah, and John, that's been such a big theme. Make the investment of time to build the system relationships. To build the trust and the connectivity, so that there's no, that we move beyond winners and losers. And I think, what's been great about your presentation is that you come at things from a very different angle, and actually you give us a lot of insight that when we combine it with the things that other people are saying as well, I think the sum is even greater than the parts. So thank you so much for getting up early and being part of our Transformathon today. And we look forward so much to continue to collaborate with you and your wisdom into the future. So thank you so much.
Helen, generous. So thank you.
Great. So Transformathon viewers. We've just finished our 7:30 session, and what we're going to do now is we're going to close down for a couple of minutes just so that we can change to our next speaker. So bear with us, and normal service will be resumed shortly.